K-pop is not drum and bass. Are you sure though? For one thing, that sounds super gatekeepy, but also when I hear songs that sound like this, it also sounds pretty inaccurate. If you happen to see my What the Fuck is K-pop video, which I'll link below, you'll know that I think it's a bit of an oversimplification to describe K-pop as a music genre. Rather, I think of K-pop as a multimedia entertainment industry that selectively borrows elements from other established genres and cultures and repackages them for a different audience. Specifically people from South Korea, but also the broader international community as well on a secondary level. Unlike J-pop, which had the luxury of a giant market built in Japan, Korea was a relatively small market, so they had no choice but to market to an international community. As a result, K-pop developed a unique and eclectic sound that borrows from music all over the world. Much to my delight, one of the subgenres that's been trending this year is drum and bass, a genre that I happen to have followed for more than a decade and a half before I discovered K-pop. It's definitely really cool to hear sounds I've known and loved being incorporated into a totally separate genre I also happen to love, but it fascinates me to observe how K-pop can sound practically indistinguishable from music I've listened to for years, while simultaneously being very unlike it in terms of all the culture surrounding it. So today, we are overthinking not only K-pop, but also drum and bass. We're going to break it down into 4 separate areas. We're going to talk about the sound, the artists, the industry, and the live experience. And then we'll go through individual subtopics within each one of those chapters. I'll put down the details pertaining to drum and bass in purple and K-pop in pink. Hopefully that'll make it easier to follow. Famous last words. Let's go. Chapter 1. The sound. Let's start by looking at where they both take their inspiration from. I already mentioned that K-pop borrows heavily from other genres, but because drum and bass music is generally created digitally on a computer with the use of an audio production software such as Ableton or Logic, it has a lot of freedom to incorporate samples from other music genres. And it particularly borrows heavily from UK garage, breaks, and jungle. But it definitely doesn't end there. I can't make an episode about drum and bass without mentioning the iconic Amen break, or the most famous 6-second drum solo of all time, from the song Amen Brother by the 1960s funk and soul group The Winstons. It has been sampled countless times and reused in numerous genres, including drum and bass, which came to be defined by the distinct pattern and rhythmic complexity characterized by the Amen break. So given all of that, I think it would be pretty fair to say that drum and bass borrows pretty heavily from other genres. And, spoiler alert, that's pretty much where the similarities end. When you talk about the beats, for drum and bass, it's pretty specific. They're generally between 160 to 180-ish beats per minute, and they're always syncopated. For K-pop, it certainly can sound like that, but it could also sound like anything else. Literally, the sky's the limit. As far as the vocals are concerned, for K-pop, they're basically mandatory, and for drum and bass, they're totally optional. Drum and bass is produced by the people who are performing it, generally speaking, whereas K-pop is usually produced by other people behind the scenes. And so the dancing and the vocals are really what you're there for when you're seeing a K-pop performer. But we'll get a little bit more into that later. The important thing is that a K-pop single has to have vocals. If it doesn't, it's not K-pop, or it's not a single. I'd say it's probably about 50-50 on how many drum and bass songs include vocals. Sometimes it'll only be one sample repeated a few times, and sometimes there's lyrics going through the whole song. Sometimes there's nothing. You never know. As far as rap is concerned, almost every K-pop song includes at least one rap section. Definitely not required though. They're never improvised. K-pop is not about freestyling. All of these raps will be written ahead of time and carefully rehearsed before they're ever recorded. Drum and bass, on the other hand, likes to feature MCs. Hold that thought. We'll come back to those. The other parameter where these two genres most clearly distinguish themselves from one another is in the song length. Particularly recently, K-pop songs are short and sweet because they're going to be choreographed and they have to be performed live on music shows. Drum and bass songs, on the other hand, can go very long and usually will include long intros and outros to help DJs mix them into their sets, which you will never find in K-pop. To give you an example of how dramatic this distinction is, one of my favorite Black Sun Empire tracks is a song called Gun Seller. Gun Seller starts super slow with an intense build and it doesn't fully drop until 2 minutes and 36 seconds in. New Jeans' drum and bass adjacent K-pop track Super Shy is 2 minutes and 34 seconds long total. That is to say, Gun Seller does not fully drop until the entire length of Super Shy is over. Chapter 2. But artists. The first, most obvious difference between drum and bass artists and K-pop artists is the presence of a trainee program, which is to say that K-pop has one and drum and bass does not. The trainee program definitely could merit an entire episode of its own, so post down in the comments if you'd be interested in that. The presence of women is very different between the two genres. K-pop idols are roughly a 50-50 mix of men and women, but most of the producers are men. In drum and bass, pretty much all of the producers are men. Are they attractive? In K-pop it's mandatory, in drum and bass it's unlikely. Drum and bass doesn't have that same kind of emphasis on personal aesthetics of the performers that K-pop does. As a result, most of them are just crusty old dudes in baseball hats. As far as their ages go, K-pop idols are always young, whereas most drum and bass DJs are kind of on the older side because the genre's been around for a little while. Groups are more common in K-pop than soloists by far, and drum and bass is the opposite. While multi-person acts like Pendulum, Noisia, and Chase and Status do exist, solo artists are more common by far. However, they make up for it by having a lot of collaborations, which are very uncommon in K-pop by comparison. Chapter 3. The industry. K-pop requires the performers to dance. Like, non-negotiable, required. If I was to walk up to Sub Focus and demand that he dance at his show, he would laugh at me, rightfully so, because dance performance ability is not an expectation placed on drum and bass DJs in the West at all. I say DJ and producer kind of interchangeably. Really, they're expected to be able to do both skill sets, so they don't have to dance, but they do have to DJ. Record labels are totally optional for drum and bass DJs. There are many artists who self-produce, either because they don't have access to record contracts or because they like the creative freedom it affords them. On the other hand, in K-pop, record labels are absolutely mandatory. It is simply impossible to produce on the scale that is expected of K-pop idols in your backyard, in your basement. Really, this comes down to a matter of funds. Drum and bass has been around for more than 2 decades, but it never really came to the forefront of EDM. It's always been a perpetually underground but faithful genre. In contrast, K-pop is as high budget as it comes. The production values are expected to be through the roof, which is why it's required for you to have a record label in order to coordinate all of that. You can't just drop K-pop on SoundCloud. And because so much money goes into it, it means that the barriers to entry in K-pop are essentially infinite. Those aren't boobs, I swear. I tried to draw an infinity sign 20 times and that was the best I got. Because it's entirely possible to self-produce drum and bass, the barriers to entry there are theoretically minimal. However, I've been going to these shows for long enough to know that in practice, women and minorities are heavily disadvantaged within the scene. Why? I don't have a good reason. I specifically try to catch disadvantaged acts whenever they come through town, but they're few and far between. If you know of any great acts from underrepresented populations, drop them in the comments so that I can check them out. I'm really fortunate that Denver has a very robust bass scene, so there's a lot of opportunities to catch drum and bass live, which, let's talk about that. Chapter 4. The live experience. Now, to be fair, I've been to so many dozens of drum and bass shows and only 2 K-pop shows, so I'm not speaking from too much experience on that part. I will tell you though, I immediately noticed something was different when I went to go buy my tickets to the first one and they asked me what kind of seats I wanted to purchase. Because evidently at K-pop shows, your seats may be assigned, with chairs. Thankfully, they still also had cheap standing room tickets, which is what I went for, and I regretted nothing because I still got a great view. But there's no such thing as chairs at a drum and bass show. That's just unheard of. Mostly because when you go to a drum and bass show, you're there to dance rather than to see someone else dance. And that's reflected in the stage setups. K-pop stages will be a blank canvas with room for the idols to dance and maybe some stools or mic stands for them to use in between songs. Drum and bass stages will always have a DJ booth, and then they'll have visualizers if there's budget for it. Some of these shows are really cheap and happen in basements, which you'll never find for a K-pop show. Like I said, this is an underground genre, and it always will be. If you do get tickets to a K-pop show, make sure you get there on time because they generally don't have openers, which was a big surprise to me as well, because drum and bass shows always have openers. If you're there to see the headliner, there's almost a 0% chance they're going to be the person that's playing when the doors open. It gives people time to accumulate, and it gives an opportunity for newer artists to be exposed to new audiences. I've discovered so many artists I love by seeing them open for another artist I was there to see. However, due to the high costs affiliated with international touring, K-pop groups generally won't have openers coming with them. I know Vicha was opening for Twice, and that was a really big deal because, oh my god, Vicha is going on tour with Twice. Evidently that's a big thing. For what it's worth, when I saw Everglow and Purple Kiss last year, neither one of them had openers. We'll say rarely. I mentioned earlier that the way that the songs are performed really ties into the length, because K-pop groups will perform the song from start to finish in its entirety, with a break between. This is definitely not how drum and bass sets work. Drum and bass DJs will perform continuous mixes with blended, incomplete playthroughs of songs that they like, either that they performed themselves or by other artists. And unfortunately, sometimes they will be accompanied by MCs. MCs are basically people that you didn't pay to see, didn't know you were going to see, who just grab a microphone and scream mercilessly into it for you to put your hands up at inopportune times throughout the set. At no point do they ever improve the experience in any way whatsoever. The best of all possible MCs is tolerable at best, and every drum and bass set would be better without the MC. No, I will not change my mind on this point. Fortunately, K-pop will never subject you to this because that would be way too random and left to improvisation, and we absolutely could not have that. Instead, you just get to stand around and listen to the performers talk between their songs while they catch their breath. It's such a wildly different experience, it boggles the mind, honestly. Hopefully that helps clear it up a little bit for you. Thanks for your patience with how wildly manic this episode turned out. Speaking of that, I swear that New Jeans episode really is coming someday, but I decided to take my user suggestion and build the ultimate boy group next week, so you're not going to want to miss that one. Both of those episodes should slap, so hit the subscribe button because it costs you literally nothing. And free is my favorite color. This episode featured background music by Telomere. You can check him out on Bandcamp, which I'll link below. Thanks for watching. Don't be toxic, and I'll catch you next time.